The hurricane winds had already reached Category 3 when Lieutenant Olivia Maxwell arrived at Langley Air Force Base, knowing she faced another day of quiet humiliation. The flight line stretched before her like a museum display of aeronautical excellence, gleaming F-35s, immaculate F-15EXs, and even a visiting formation of Navy FSA-18 Super Hornets that reflected the early morning light like polished mirrors. These were the aircraft that mattered, the ones featured in recruitment, videos and Air Force press releases. Then there was her assignment, isolated at the farthest corner of the tarmac, where the concrete had begun to crack and maintenance equipment sat forgotten. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The F-22 Raptor that everyone simply called Hull 237 stood apart from the others. Its stealth coating had faded to an uneven gray, panel edges chipped from years of hard service. Dust from recent storms had settled into the seams that no maintenance crew had bothered to clean in weeks. The aircraft's identification number was barely visible, the faded digits marking it as one of the oldest operational Raptors in the fleet, a testbed aircraft, now deemed suitable only for the base's least favored pilot. "Morning, Washout," Lieutenant Daniel Morris called as Olivia approached the dispatch desk, his grin practiced and sharp. "Ready for another thrilling day of systems checks?" The tech officer behind the clipboard didn't even look up. "Raptor Reserve," he muttered, sliding her assignment card across the metal surface. "Standard diagnostics only. No weapon systems, no supersonic. Log any anomalies if they appear." Captain Elijah Porter leaned over from the adjacent station, his fresh flight suit still creased from supply. "She's got Hull 237 again," he said with exaggerated sympathy. "Guess they really want to make sure our flight school dropout gets plenty of quality time with the simulator that flies." The laughter that followed was brief but cutting. Olivia had heard variations of this exchange every morning for the past month, ever since her transfer to the 94th Fighter Squadron. Her previous assignment had ended abruptly after she'd reported critical flaws in the squadron's emergency response protocols, flaws that had nearly resulted in a mid-air collision during a training exercise. The official transfer document called it a strategic reassignment. Everyone knew it was punishment. She tucked the assignment card into her thigh pocket without comment. Words had ceased to matter here weeks ago. Actions were the only currency she still believed in. The walk to her jet took longer than necessary, not because of distance, but because no one cleared a path. She stepped over fuel lines, navigated around maintenance carts, and passed behind cooling units where other pilots reviewed mission briefs in the shade. Their conversations halted as she approached, resumed when she passed. "Still making her fly that museum piece," someone whispered. "At least they're keeping her busy while the investigation wraps up," came the reply, followed by knowing chuckles. When Olivia reached her aircraft, the expected silence deepened. No ground crew waited, no checklist sat prepared on the ladder. The canopy had been left open against the morning humidity, and the access ladder stood unmanned. She climbed up herself, one boot finding the tire, pushing upward with practiced efficiency. The cockpit was already warm, gathering heat in the early morning sun. She settled into the seat, placing her gloves on the console while adjusting to the temperature. The heads-up display flickered once, then dimmed to darkness. She'd been dealing with this particular malfunction for days. She tapped the edge of the mounting bracket with 2 fingers, reached behind the panel, and reset the connector. The green illumination returned, wavering but stable. Around her, the choreographed precision of a squadron preparing for real missions continued uninterrupted. Ground crews shouted coordinates over headsets. Technicians moved equipment between aircraft with practiced efficiency, and pilots gathered around tablet displays reviewing weather patterns while sipping coffee from squadron-branded mugs. Near the operations building, a public affairs team positioned cameras for the perfect shot of the morning's formation takeoff. Nobody glanced toward the isolated Raptor where Olivia sat. Her fingers moved across the instrument panel with calm familiarity, each system she activated responding with the hesitant compliance that older aircraft demanded. Above her, the control tower began calling rotation times, call signs echoing. Across the concrete, her name was conspicuously absent. She completed her pre-check and noticed a damaged data link cable that she'd flagged in yesterday's maintenance report. It remained unrepaired, the insulation split and hastily wrapped with electrical tape that was already peeling away. She reached under the panel, peeled back the tape, examined the damaged wires, then twisted them together with practiced fingers. She matched colors precisely, then secured the connection with a thin strip of conductive material from her personal toolkit. When she tested the communication system, the status light blinked green. She allowed it to fade without speaking. From across the tarmac, jets began to taxi in sequence, their wheels turning with synchronized precision, exhaust heat shimmering behind them like liquid glass. Polished canopies caught the morning light as they moved toward the runway. The media team tracked their movement, capturing the power and precision of America's primer fighter jets. Her aircraft remained motionless, heat rising from its metal skin like a desert mirage. Olivia leaned her head back against the seat, eyes closed, not from fatigue, but from focused concentration. She felt the air in the cockpit change as the temperature climbed, her fingers tracing the checklist once more, before folding it and returning it to her pocket. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She reached for her gloves, pulled them from her belt, and placed them in her lap without putting them on. She opened the throttle housing and listened carefully. The F-22 didn't purr. It grumbled. It was old, neglected, and relegated to the sidelines, but it was responding, and so was she. In the distance, Captain Porter was already climbing into his pristine F-35, his ground crew moving with choreographed efficiency. He caught sight of her through his canopy and tapped his helmet in a mocking salute, his expression mixing contempt with amusement. Tomorrow would bring another assignment card, another day of systems checks and diagnostics while the real pilots flew actual missions. But as Olivia sat in the heat-soaked cockpit of the forgotten F-22, she felt something that had been missing from her career for months. She felt purpose. The briefing room at 0600 hours was a masterclass in casual cruelty. Colonel Richard Wagner stood at the front, his pressed uniform reflecting the fluorescent lights as he scrolled through mission assignments on the digital board. Most of the pilots clustered in loose groups, thermoses in hand, barely glancing up as instructions rolled through the speakers. Formation drills, intercept protocols, approach verification. The colonel's voice carried the practiced monotone of routine briefings. Olivia waited at the back of the room, notebook ready. Her previous night's work filled the margins, hand-drawn diagrams showing wind patterns across the eastern seaboard, altitude calculations where storm cells were forming, theoretical approaches to landing in severe crosswinds. While other pilots relied on computer-generated flight plans, she had learned to read the atmosphere itself, to feel the air currents before encountering them. Raptor Reserve, Colonel Wagner's voice cut through the morning chatter. Standard. Diagnostics, systems checks, no altitude restrictions. Log any anomalies. The designation hung in the air like stale smoke. Captain Porter nudged Lieutenant Morris, both men wearing barely concealed smirks, still giving her the full push. Buttons and watch lights experience, Porter whispered, loud enough for the back row to hear. She'll be an expert at preflight checks by the time she retires. Morris's response was quieter but equally cutting. Think they'll let her actually fly something next month, or is she permanently grounded in everything but name? Olivia moved past them without acknowledgement, though she noticed the slight nod from Master Sergeant Diana Rivera, the senior avionics specialist who'd been observing the exchange from the side wall. Rivera was old-school Air Force, 30 years of keeping aircraft functioning beyond their expected lifespans had given her perspective that most officers lacked. Her eyes held something that looked like understanding. Outside, the morning weather was deteriorating rapidly. The approaching hurricane, still offshore, but moving steadily toward the Virginia coast, was already sending advance wind bands that made pre-flight checks a battle against gusting crosswinds. Olivia worked through the HUD boot sequence again. Flicker, stutter, brief static, then stability. She pulled out her notebook and clipped it to the side panel with tape. Manual calculations were more reliable anyway. By noon, she had completed 4 full diagnostic cycles. Each began with a climb into the increasingly turbulent cockpit, a systems check that barely passed minimum standards, and a careful monitoring of how the aircraft's frame responded to the strengthening winds. The instructions remained the same: observe but don't engage, record but don't exceed, document everything but fly nothing. During the lunch break, while other pilots gathered in the air-conditioned ready room, Olivia made her way to the weather monitoring station. The metal stairs rang under her boots as she climbed to the observation deck, the wind now strong enough to press against her shoulders as she leaned into the railing. She watched wind patterns forming across the approach corridor, noting how the gusts created visible patterns in the clouds. She was sketching potential landing vectors in her notebook when voices drifted up from below. Colonel Wagner speaking with the squadron operations officer. "How long are we keeping her on diagnostic duty?" the ops officer asked, his voice carrying clearly in the turbulent air. "Until she learns respect for chain of command," Wagner replied. "Maxwell thinks she knows better than established protocols. 4 weeks of pushing buttons might teach her the value of keeping opinions to herself. The pilots are starting to notice. Some think we're being too harsh. Let them think it." She questioned a direct order from flight safety, embarrassed a decorated officer, and nearly triggered a formal investigation. She's lucky she's still on flight status at all. Their footsteps faded toward the main building, leaving Olivia alone with the wind and the weight of confirmation. This wasn't about competence or training. It was about punishment for telling an uncomfortable truth. That afternoon, during a maintenance cycle, she returned to her jet with a roll of medical tape and a marker. She peeled a fresh strip, wrote 5 words in block letters, and placed it just below the right console where her wrist would naturally rest during flight. Truth flies through any storm. The cockpit didn't respond. The wind didn't change direction. But something inside her shifted fundamentally. That evening, she walked the eastern perimeter of the base, staying close to the fence line where security lights cast long shadows. In the distance, her F-22 stood illuminated, its wing catching the tower lights at an angle that transformed weathered metal into something almost majestic. She remembered another pilot, another time. Her former instructor, Commander Sarah Mitchell, had flown this same airframe during operations over Syria. She'd called it faithful, not because it was the newest or the fastest, but because it responded truthfully if you knew how to listen. That was before an electrical system malfunction had nearly cost Mitchell her life during a night operation. She'd survived, but the aircraft had been downgraded to limited operational status and eventually reassigned to test duties and occasional reserve pilot training. "They gave you the ghost plane," Mitchell had told her during their last conversation. "That jet has more combat hours than most pilots have total flight time. Don't let them convince you it's worthless just because it's battle-scarred." Standing in the growing darkness, watching the first bands of hurricane-driven rain sweep across the tarmac, Olivia understood something that the morning briefings and casual mockery couldn't touch. She wasn't being trained on this aircraft. She was being tested by it. And tomorrow, as the hurricane approached, She would continue that conversation. The next morning brought another briefing, another assignment card marked Raptor Reserve, and another round of barely concealed amusement from her fellow pilots. But as she walked across the increasingly wind-swept tarmac toward the waiting F-22, Master Sergeant Rivera intercepted her path. "Lieutenant Maxwell," she said, her voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in avionics. "Got a minute?" Olivia stopped, notebook in hand. "That Raptor you're flying," Rivera continued, glancing toward the F-22. "She's got history, more than most of these hotshots realize." She paused, studying Olivia's face. "Commander Mitchell mentioned you might understand that." "You knew?" "Mitchell kept her bird running through 2 combat deployments. Good pilot. Trusted her aircraft even when command didn't trust her." Rivera handed her a small diagnostic tablet. "Thought you might need this for tracking control response fluctuations. The onboard system misses the subtle ones." It was the first gesture of support she'd received in weeks, simple, practical, and loaded with meaning that transcended words. "Thank you, Sergeant." Rivera nodded and walked away, leaving Olivia standing at the edge of the flight, lined with a diagnostic tablet and the growing certainty that she wasn't as alone as she'd thought. The call came at 0530 hours, jarring Olivia from restless sleep. Lieutenant Morris's voice crackled through the base phone system with barely contained excitement. "Maxwell, get down here. Your bird's been flagged for emergency maintenance inspection." She was dressed and moving before the implications fully registered. Emergency inspections meant grounding, which meant her already limited flight status would be reduced to nothing. By the time she reached the flight line, a small crowd had gathered around hull 237. Colonel Wagner stood beside the aircraft with Chief Inspector Margaret Townsend, both examining a thick folder of documentation. Townsend looked up as Olivia approached, her expression unreadable. "Lieutenant Maxwell, we've received an anonymous report questioning the airworthiness of this aircraft. Allegations include improper maintenance, unauthorized modifications, and potential safety violations." Olivia's eyes swept the gathered crowd, landing on Captain Porter and Lieutenant Morris. Neither man met her gaze, but Morris is satisfied. Smirk told her everything she needed to know. "I'd like to see the specific allegations," Olivia said carefully. "That's not how this works," Colonel Wagner interjected. "The aircraft is grounded pending full inspection. You're reassigned to administrative duties until further notice." "Sir, I've been maintaining detailed logs of every system check. Every modification is documented, and this decision is final, Lieutenant." The words hit like a physical blow. Administrative duties meant filing reports, updating databases, and watching other pilots fly missions while she processed paperwork. It was career death by 1,000 cuts. As the crowd dispersed, Master Sergeant Rivera appeared at her elbow. "Walk with me," she said quietly. They moved away from the aircraft toward the maintenance hangar, where Rivera's office occupied a corner, cluttered with technical manuals and coffee-stained work orders. "Anonymous report," Rivera said, closing the door behind them. "You know what that means. Someone wants me gone. Someone wants you silent. There's a difference." Rivera pulled a tablet from her desk drawer. "Commander Mitchell left this for you. Said to give it to you if things got complicated." On the tablet were copies of maintenance records, flight logs, and a video message from Mitchell herself. Olivia played the video, Mitchell's familiar face appearing on the screen. "Olivia, if you're watching this, they've pushed too far. The attached records show what really happened during my last mission. The electrical system didn't just malfunction. It was compromised by substandard parts that were certified despite failing quality control. The investigation was buried to protect someone's career. Use this if you need it. Trust the aircraft. Trust yourself. Mitchell out." The documents painted a picture of systematic cover-up involving faulty components, ignored safety reports, and a decorated officer who'd rather destroy evidence than admit mistakes. The same officer who'd questioned Olivia's judgment 4 weeks ago, Colonel Wagner. Mitchell tried to go through proper channels, Rivera explained. Filed reports requested. Investigations followed every protocol. They transferred her to a desk job in Tucson and buried the paperwork, and now they're doing the same thing to you. With one difference, Olivia noted. What's that? Rivera smiled grimly. You've got something Mitchell didn't. What? You've got an audience. Those pilots who've been laughing at you, some of them are starting to pay attention. They've seen you work, seen how you handle that aircraft. Word gets around. That afternoon, while Inspector Townsend conducted her examination, Olivia was assigned to the base records officer, a windowless room filled with filing cabinets and computer terminals. Her official task was updating pilot certification databases. But she had other priorities. Military records were digital now, but they still followed patterns. Every transfer, every disciplinary action, every training reassignment left tracks if you knew where to look. Olivia began following those tracks, working backward from her own reassignment through a pattern of similar cases. She found Lieutenant Rachel Saunders, transferred after questioning fuel allocation procedures. Captain Michael Rodriguez, reassigned following a safety report about maintenance shortcuts. First Lieutenant Thomas Parker, grounded permanently after witnessing a training accident that never appeared in official reports. The pattern was clear. Colonel Wagner had been systematically removing pilots who asked uncomfortable questions. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd kept detailed records of his own actions, probably to justify them to his superiors. By evening, Olivia had compiled a comprehensive file documenting not just her own situation, but a wider pattern of retaliation against whistleblowers. The evidence was damning, but she needed more than documentation. She needed witnesses. The opportunity came sooner than expected. The Hurricane, now upgraded to Category 4, had accelerated its approach to the Virginia coast. All non-essential personnel were being evacuated from the base, and aircraft were being secured or relocated. Inland, as the base battened down for the storm, Inspector Townsend completed her examination of Hull 237. The aircraft is structurally sound, she announced to the squadron leadership gathered in the operations center. No evidence of unauthorized modifications. However, I did find evidence of substandard maintenance, not by Lieutenant Maxwell, but by the regular maintenance crews. Routine service items were consistently overlooked or performed below standard. Colonel Wagner showed no reaction to this vindication and no intention of returning Olivia to flight status. The aircraft will be secured in Hangar C for the duration of the storm, he announced to the assembled pilots. Lieutenant Maxwell remains on administrative assignment, pending further evaluation of her judgment and attitude. That's when Captain Porter spoke up, the last person Olivia expected to defend her. Sir, with respect, what exactly is Lieutenant Maxwell being evaluated for? She's been handling that Raptor better than most of us manage our primary aircraft. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Lieutenant Morris looked uncomfortable, suddenly finding his emergency procedures manual fascinating. Lieutenant Maxwell has demonstrated a pattern of insubordination and poor decision-making, Wagner replied stiffly. Like what? The question came from Captain Jordan Cruz, a decorated pilot who rarely spoke during briefings. Because from where I sit, she's been professional, prepared, and competent, more than some. Colonel Wagner's face flushed red. This discussion is over. Anyone else who wants to question my decisions can join Lieutenant Maxwell in records management. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a crash site, but instead of silencing dissent, it crystallized something that had been building for weeks. These pilots had been watching, evaluating, and reaching their own conclusions about what they were witnessing. As the briefing ended, Captain Cruz approached Olivia in the hallway. I've been flying for 14 years, she said quietly. "I know talent when I see it. Whatever's happening here, it's not about your flying ability. It's about politics," Olivia replied. "And you're on the wrong side." Cruz studied her for a moment. "Maybe, or maybe you're on the right side, and that's exactly the problem." That night, alone in her quarters, Olivia spread Mitchell's documents across her desk alongside her own research. The evidence was overwhelming, but evidence without a platform was just paper. She needed a way to make it matter. She thought about the hurricane that was now less than 8 hours from making landfall, strong enough to ground every aircraft except those flown by pilots, desperate enough to prove a point that couldn't be made with words. She pulled out her notebook and began planning what might be her last flight. The weather reports confirmed what Olivia had been tracking for days. The hurricane, now named Eliza, would make landfall directly over Langley Air Force Base within 12 hours. The Category 4 storm would bring sustained winds exceeding 140 miles per hour and near zero visibility conditions that would shut down all flight operations. Standard protocol required visual flight rules for takeoff and landing with no exceptions. But standards, as she'd learned, were often more flexible than they appeared in official documentation. In the records office, surrounded by the mechanical hum of computers and filing systems, Olivia continued her research. The pattern of Colonel Wagner's retaliation was even more extensive than she'd initially discovered. Over the past 5 years, he'd systematically removed or reassigned 23 pilots who'd raised safety concerns, questioned procedures, or challenged his authority. The most damning evidence came from a classified incident report she'd found buried in the digital archives. 3 years ago, during a night training exercise, faulty maintenance had caused an F-35 to lose hydraulic power during landing. Pilot had managed to bring the aircraft down safely, but the subsequent investigation revealed a pattern of cut corners and ignored safety protocols that traced directly to Colonel Wagner's cost-cutting initiatives. The investigating officer had been Captain Lauren Barnes, a decorated pilot with an impeccable record. Her report was thorough, detailed, and devastating. It was also the last official document she'd filed before being transferred to a remote monitoring station in Alaska. Captain Barnes's phone number was listed in the base directory. When Olivia called that evening, her voice carried the weariness of someone who'd fought this battle before. "I wondered when someone would finally dig up that report," she said. "I've been waiting 3 years for this call." "You still have copies?" "Every document, every photo, every witness statement. I knew they'd try to bury it, so I kept backups of everything." She paused. "But evidence doesn't matter if nobody's willing to listen. What if we could make them listen?" "How?" Olivia explained her plan, or at least the parts she'd formulated. The hurricane, the opportunity to demonstrate capabilities that went beyond what anyone expected. The chance to prove that sometimes the most dangerous choice is to do nothing when action is required. Captain Barnes listened without interruption. "That's either brilliant or suicidal," she said finally. "Probably both. Will you help?" "I'll do better than that. I'll make some calls." The next morning brought a subtle shift in the squadron's atmosphere. During the emergency hurricane preparations briefing, Olivia noticed more pilots glancing her way, not with amusement, but with something that looked like curiosity. Captain Cruz sat in the front row, taking notes with unusual intensity. Even Lieutenant Morris seemed less comfortable with his casual mockery. Colonel Wagner, however, remained unmoved. "All aircraft are to be secured in hardened shelters by 1400 hours, he announced. "Lieutenant Maxwell will continue administrative duties, assisting with documentation of storm preparations." No one spoke, but the silence felt different, charged with unspoken questions. After the briefing, Master Sergeant Rivera intercepted Olivia outside the operations center. "Word's getting around," she said, "about the inspection, about the patterns. People are starting to notice." "What kind of noticing?" The kind that happens when good people realize they've been part of something wrong. Rivera handed her a folded paper, security schedules for the next 24 hours. In case you need to know who's watching what, she said. The hurricane evacuation has left gaps in the rotation. The paper showed exactly what Olivia had hoped. During the height of the storm, skeleton crews would be focused on structural integrity and emergency response. Aircraft security would be minimal, especially for planes already deemed non-critical. That afternoon, Captain Cruz found her in the records office. "I've been looking into some things," Cruz said, closing the door behind her. "About pilots who've been transferred or reassigned over the past few years. The pattern is concerning. You're risking your career by being here." "Maybe, but I didn't join the Air Force to watch good pilots get destroyed for doing the right thing." Cruz pulled a chair close to Olivia's desk. "What do you need?" For the first time in weeks, Olivia felt something she'd almost forgotten. "Hope. I need someone in the tower," she said carefully. "Someone who understands that sometimes the most important flights don't appear in the official logs." Cruz's eyes narrowed. "You're planning something." "I'm planning to fly the way it's supposed to be done, with integrity, even in a hurricane." "That's not flying. That's potentially suicide. Not if you know how to listen to your aircraft." They talked for another hour, working through details that couldn't be written down or officially documented. Cruz would use her connections to ensure the right people were in position when the moment came. She wouldn't participate directly. Her career was too valuable to risk on a gesture that might fail, but she would create opportunities for others to act. That evening, Olivia walked the perimeter of the airfield one final time before the outer bands of Hurricane Eliza arrived in full force. The air was thick with moisture, and wind gusts were already approaching 60 miles per hour. Lightning flashed continuously on the horizon, illuminating the wall of clouds that approached from the Atlantic. Tomorrow would bring the full fury of the storm. The evacuation of all non-essential personnel, and her chance to prove something that couldn't be demonstrated in briefing rooms or written reports. Her F-22 sat in Hangar C, looking small and forgotten under the emergency lighting. But as she approached using her maintenance access card, she noticed something different. The aircraft had been prepared, not just the routine securing that. All jets received before storms, but a detailed preparation that went beyond protocol. The intake covers were precisely fitted, the canopy was immaculately cleaned, and she could see that the internal battery had been fully charged rather than disconnected as regulations required. A small note was tucked into the pilot's entry handhold. "She's ready when you need her, MSR." Olivia climbed into the cockpit one more time, running through her mental checklist in the gathering darkness. Everything she needed was in place: the documentation, the witnesses, the weather window, and most importantly, the aircraft itself. The return flight through the eye wall was even more violent than the departure, with the aircraft shuddering against forces that exceeded its design limitations. But she emerged into the eye with the runway in sight, the blue circle of calm, now visibly shrinking as the back wall of the hurricane approached from the south. She had less than 10 minutes to land before the full fury of Eliza's second half would make touchdown impossible. In the Emergency Operations Center, word of the impossible flight had spread quickly. Colonel Wagner pushed through the crowd of personnel gathered around the radar display, his face contorted with rage. "Who authorized this flight?" he demanded. "Sir, no flight plan was filed," the operations officer replied carefully. "This appears to be an emergency response." "To what emergency?" "Get her on the radio immediately. Order her to abort." Captain Cruz, who had been monitoring the situation from a communications station, turned to face the colonel. "Sir, the aircraft is reporting critical hydraulic failure. Aborting now would guarantee a crash. Lieutenant Maxwell is attempting an emergency landing in the only available window before the second half of the hurricane arrives." "She stole that aircraft." She's violating direct orders. She's flying, sir, Cruz responded evenly. And right now, she's the only one who can bring that aircraft back safely. At 800 feet, Olivia felt the F-22 settle into its approach profile. The runway was clearly visible in the strange light of the hurricane's eye, but the calm was rapidly disappearing. The southern edge of the eye wall was already beginning to cover the far end of the runway, bringing renewed rain and wind. Her left hand made continuous adjustments to the throttle, compensating for the aircraft's tendency to yaw with the failing hydraulics. Her right hand held the stick with measured pressure, feeling how the control surfaces were responding and adapting her inputs accordingly. Contact at 500 feet, the tower reported. Approach looks stable. Be advised, wind shift advancing from south to north across the runway. Acknowledged. At 300 feet, the aircraft shuddered violently as another hydraulic line failed. The control stick suddenly went slack in her hand. The fly-by-wire system had lost pressure. She was now flying an F-22 with mechanical backups only, something the aircraft was theoretically capable of, but that no pilot had ever attempted in combat or emergency conditions. In that moment, time seemed to slow down. All the diagnostics she'd run, all the system checks she'd performed, all the quiet hours learning how this particular aircraft responded to inputs, it all came down to this approach. Tower, switching to manual backup, she reported, her voice steady despite the crisis. Request runway status. Runway clear. Eye wall approaching threshold in approximately 2 minutes. At 200 feet, Olivia felt the F-22 fighting against the increasing crosswinds as the hurricane's eye began to close around her. The manual backup controls were stiff and unresponsive compared to the normal fly-by-wire system, requiring physical strength as much as finesse. Her arms strained against forces that the aircraft's designers had never intended a human pilot to counteract directly. The runway was disappearing under the advancing wall of rain, visible in sections that shrank with each passing second. She could see the southern end already engulfed in the returning storm, a gray curtain of water advancing toward her like a living thing. 100 feet, came the call from the tower. Wind shift at 30 knots and climbing. The aircraft wanted to drift sideways with the crosswind. In a functioning F-22, the flight computer would have made thousands of minute adjustments per second to maintain the approach path. With manual controls, Olivia had to anticipate each gust, each shift in the air currents, compensating before the aircraft could react. At 50 feet, the rain hit her like a physical barrier. Visibility dropped to near zero in an instant as the eye wall engulfed her position. The runway lights became faint, flickering points in a sea of gray. The aircraft rolled hard to the left as a 70-knot gust struck the right wing. Olivia countered with full opposite stick, using the throttle to maintain a descent rate that would bring her to the runway without dropping too quickly. The F-22 responded sluggishly, but it responded. She was having a conversation with the aircraft through the controls, feeling its answers through the airframe's vibrations and movements. 30 feet, the tower called, though how they could track her position in the returning storm was a mystery. Perhaps radar, perhaps faith, centerline approach. The main landing gear touched concrete with a force that shook the entire airframe. The nose gear followed a heartbeat later, and suddenly the F-22 was on the ground, rolling through a hurricane with minimal control authority. Olivia fought the aircraft down the runway, using differential braking to keep it tracking straight as 100 mph crosswinds tried to push it sideways. The anti-skid system had failed with the hydraulics, meaning any excessive brake pressure could lock the wheels on the rain-slicked concrete. She modulated the brakes by feel, letting the aircraft slow gradually despite the storm's efforts to claim it. After what seemed like an eternity, but was actually less than 20 seconds, the F-22 slowed enough that the wind couldn't overcome its mass. She guided it toward the nearest taxiway, visibility so poor she was navigating largely by memory and the occasional glimpse of taxiway lights. "Aircraft on ground," she reported through the radio, proceeding to Hangar C. For several seconds, there was only static in response. Then a voice, not the controllers, but someone else in the tower. "That was impossible. Confirmed touchdown," came the official response. "Welcome back to Langley, Lieutenant." She taxied slowly. Through the full fury of Hurricane Eliza, the aircraft shuddering with each gust, but remaining controllable at ground speed. When she reached Hangar C, she found the damage to the doors had worsened, but the opening remained passable. She guided the F-22 inside, powering down the engines as emergency crews in weather gear rushed toward the aircraft. As the canopy opened, she was surprised to see not just the emergency responders, but a small crowd of base personnel who had taken shelter in the hangar. Among them stood Master Sergeant Rivera, Captain Cruz, and several pilots from the morning briefing. As she climbed down from the cockpit, exhausted but steady, an unexpected sound rose above the howling of the hurricane outside. Applause. It was spontaneous and genuine, not the polite acknowledgement of rank or protocol, but the visceral recognition of something extraordinary. These were aviators and ground crew who understood exactly what they had just witnessed. Master Sergeant Rivera reached her first, rain gear dripping onto the hangar floor. "Lieutenant," she said quietly, "that was the finest piece of flying I've seen in 30 years. Before Olivia could respond, figures pushed through the small crowd. Captain Cruz appeared first, followed by other pilots, all looking at her with expressions ranging from amazement to newfound respect. "How did you do that?" Lieutenant Morris asked, his earlier mockery replaced by genuine wonder. "The hydraulics were completely gone on final approach." "I listened," Olivia replied simply. Colonel Wagner was the last to arrive, his expression thunderous as he pushed through the gathered personnel. "Lieutenant Maxwell," he barked, "you are under arrest for theft of military aircraft, violation of direct orders, and reckless endangerment." The hangar fell silent, the only sound the continuing roar of the hurricane outside. Then Captain Cruz stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of her combat experience. "Sir, I monitored the entire flight from emergency operations." Lieutenant Maxwell filed an appropriate emergency evaluation report, maintained proper radio contact, and executed a textbook emergency landing in conditions that demonstrated exceptional airmanship. She violated a direct grounding order. The order was to secure aircraft against hurricane conditions, Cruz continued calmly. Lieutenant Maxwell conducted a critical evaluation flight that has provided invaluable data about both aircraft performance in extreme weather and pilot capability in emergency situations. I believe Air Combat Command will be very interested in her report. The crowd around them had grown larger, and Olivia realized that their voices were carrying clearly in the enclosed space. Every word of this confrontation was being heard by dozens of witnesses. "Furthermore," Cruz added, "I believe Captain Barnes from the Inspector General's office has been trying to reach you, Colonel. Something about reviewing historical safety reports and maintenance procedures." Colonel Wagner's face went white. The name Barnes clearly meant something to him, something that made the unauthorized flight suddenly seem like a minor concern. "This isn't over," he said finally, but his voice had lost its thunder. As the crowd began to disperse, returning to their emergency duties, Lieutenant Morris approached Olivia once more. "I owe you an apology," he said. "We all do. That landing. That was something I didn't think was possible." Olivia nodded acknowledgement, but her attention was focused on the small piece of tape still visible in the cockpit, bearing its 5-word message that had proven prophetic. "Truth flies through any storm." The hurricane continued to batter Langley Air Force Base for another 6 hours, causing significant damage to several facilities, but no loss of life. As the winds finally subsided and emergency crews began assessing the aftermath, Olivia found herself summoned to a secure conference room in the base command center. She expected to find Colonel Wagner and a formal disciplinary board. Instead, she was greeted by Brigadier General Samantha Westfield, the wing commander who had flown in from the Pentagon as soon as air operations were deemed safe. General Westfield did not waste time on pleasantries. "Lieutenant Maxwell," she said, "I've just reviewed the preliminary data from your flight. The recorder was functioning throughout, giving us a complete picture of both the aircraft's performance and your actions. Would you care to explain what possessed you to fly a grounded F-22 into a Category 4 hurricane?" Olivia chose her words carefully. "General, I wasn't trying to prove anything about myself. I was trying to prove something about the aircraft. That F-22 has been written off as unreliable, unworthy of full operational status. But it's been maintained by dedicated professionals, and it's capable of extraordinary performance when flown. With respect." She paused, thinking of all the pilots who had been silenced over the years. "I suppose the same could be said about the people who fly them." General Westfield studied her for a long moment. "The weather conditions today were genuinely dangerous. You could have been killed." "Yes, ma'am. But I've been dying slowly for weeks, watching my career destroyed for telling the truth. Today felt like the first time in months that I was actually living." The general nodded slowly. "Captain Cruz tells me you've been conducting detailed hydraulic, failure simulations, and emergency landing calculations for weeks. You didn't just decide to fly in a hurricane, you prepared for it." "Yes, ma'am. I've been studying this aircraft and these conditions since my assignment began. I knew that if the opportunity presented itself, I would be ready." "And you were willing to stake your career on that preparation?" "I was willing to stake my career on the truth, General. The truth about what happened to Commander Mitchell, about what's been happening to other pilots, and about what this aircraft is actually capable of when flown by someone who respects its true capabilities." General Westfield was quiet for several minutes, reviewing the flight data displayed on the tablet before her. Finally, she looked up. "Lieutenant Maxwell, effective immediately, you are reassigned to the Advanced Weather Operations Division at Edwards Air Force Base. Your new role will be to evaluate aircraft performance under extreme conditions and to develop training protocols for emergency situations." She paused. "I believe your particular skills will be valuable in that capacity." "Thank you, General." "Don't thank me yet. Your first assignment will be to write a comprehensive report on today's flight, including detailed analysis of the techniques and preparation that made it possible. That report will become part of the advanced pilot training curriculum." As the meeting concluded and Olivia prepared to leave, General Westfield added one final comment. "Lieutenant, what you did today wasn't just good flying. It was the kind of moral courage that defines the best officers. Remember that when you're training the next generation." Outside the conference room, Captain Cruz was waiting. "You realize what you've done, don't you?" she asked. "Ended my career in spectacular fashion?" Cruz smiled. "You've changed the conversation about what's possible, about who gets to define competence, about the value of preparation and integrity over politics and appearances." She paused. "That landing will be talked about for years. But more importantly, every pilot who was silenced or marginalized will know that someone finally fought back and won." That evening, as the sun set over a storm-ravaged Langley Air Force Base, Olivia returned to Hangar C one final time. The F-22 sat under temporary lighting, damage visible but dignity intact. Tomorrow it would be transferred to Edwards Air Force Base, where its capabilities would be properly evaluated and respected. She climbed into the cockpit and sat quietly, reflecting on the day's events. The small piece of tape was still there, bearing its simple message, "Truth flies through any storm." She had flown through the storm, both literal and metaphorical. But more importantly, others had been watching, learning that sometimes the greatest act of loyalty is to stand against wrongdoing, even when it comes from those in authority. The hurricane had passed, and everything was clear at last. 3 months later, Captain Olivia Maxwell stood before a packed auditorium at the Air Force Academy, delivering the keynote address for the annual Aviation Leadership and Integrity Conference. The audience included pilots, instructors, and senior officers from across all military branches, gathered to hear from the woman who had become known for landing a critically damaged F-22 in hurricane conditions. "Aviation is built on trust," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "Trust in our aircraft, trust in our training, and trust in each other. But trust must be earned through competence, maintained through integrity, and defended when it comes under attack." In the front row sat General Westfield, Captain Cruz, and Master Sergeant Rivera, who had been promoted to Chief Master Sergeant and now oversaw maintenance operations for the entire test wing. Captain Barnes, recently promoted to Major, sat nearby with a small smile of satisfaction. Their combined efforts had led to the most comprehensive investigation of command misconduct in recent Air Force history. Colonel Wagner had been court-martialed and dismissed from the service. 5 other officers had been disciplined for their roles in covering up safety violations. Most importantly, 23 pilots who had been unfairly transferred or marginalized had been contacted and offered opportunities to return to meaningful assignments. "The aircraft I flew that day was considered obsolete, unreliable, worthy only of diagnostic duty and eventual retirement," Olivia continued. "But that F-22 had logged more combat hours than most of you will fly in your entire careers. It had brought pilots home safely from missions around the world. It deserved better than dismissal, and so did the people who had been assigned to fly it." The F-22 in question now served as the primary test aircraft for the Advanced Weather Operations program that Olivia had developed. The program trained pilots to operate in conditions previously considered impossible, using techniques that combined traditional instrument flying with a kind of intuitive airmanship that came only through deep understanding of aircraft behavior. "Leadership requires more than rank and authority," Olivia said, her eyes scanning the audience. "It requires the courage to defend what's right, even when doing so is difficult or dangerous. It requires listening to voices that challenge conventional wisdom, especially when those voices come from people who have been marginalized or dismissed." Lieutenant Morris sat in the middle section, his expression thoughtful. His mockery had turned to respect, and he now served as a flight instructor, teaching cadets about the importance of both technical skill and moral courage. "The hurricane that day represented more than just weather conditions," Olivia continued. "It represented the obscurity that allows misconduct to flourish, the confusion that prevents truth from being seen clearly, and the isolation that makes good people doubt their own judgment." Major Barnes nodded from her seat. Her original investigation had been vindicated, and she now headed a new office dedicated to protecting whistleblowers and ensuring that safety concerns received proper attention. The case had become a model for how systematic problems could be identified and corrected when good people were willing to take risks for the greater good. "But hurricanes pass," Olivia said. "Truth emerges. And when it does, we have a choice. We can pretend we never saw clearly, or we can act on what the light reveals." The speech concluded to sustained applause, but for Olivia, the real measure of success was not in the recognition she had received. It was in the letters she received from pilots who felt empowered to report safety concerns, in the policy changes that protected those who challenged authority appropriately, and in the knowledge that her actions had prevented others from suffering the isolation and retaliation she had endured. After the ceremony, she was approached by a young lieutenant with familiar determination in her eyes. "Captain Maxwell," the lieutenant said, "I'm Lieutenant Sofia Rodriguez. I've been assigned to your weather operations program." "What's your background, Lieutenant?" I've been flying training missions mostly, ma'am. Routine operations. But I've been studying your techniques, and I think there's a lot more we could accomplish with proper preparation and the right mindset. Olivia smiled, recognizing something of herself in the young officer's intensity. What makes you think that? Because I've been listening, ma'am. To the aircraft, to the weather patterns, to the stories that don't make it into official reports. And I think there's more possible than most people realize. That's exactly the right attitude. Report to Edwards on Monday morning. We'll start with the fundamentals and see how far your listening skills can take you. That evening, Olivia returned to her office at Edwards Air Force Base, where her old F-22 was visible through the window. The aircraft had been fully restored, its systems upgraded and its exterior refinished, but it still bore the same hull number that had marked it as forgotten and obsolete. On her desk sat a framed copy of the small piece of tape that had guided her through those difficult weeks. Truth flies through any storm. Below it was a new addition, a photo of her landing during Hurricane Eliza, captured by a security camera that had somehow continued functioning through the storm. The image showed the F-22 emerging from a wall of rain, perfectly aligned with the runway despite conditions that should have made such precision impossible. But the image that meant the most to her was a group photo from the previous weeks. Graduation ceremony for the Advanced Weather Operations Program. 18 pilots from different backgrounds and aircraft types had completed the intensive training, each one now qualified to operate in conditions that would have grounded previous generations of aviators. They represented something new in military aviation, a recognition that expertise came from dedication and integrity rather than just rank and protocol. They were proof that listening carefully and preparing thoroughly could overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable. As she prepared to leave for the day, Olivia's phone rang. It was Commander Mitchell, calling from her new position as Director of Flight Safety at the Naval Air Systems Command. "Saw the speech online," she said. "You've come a long way from being the flight school dropout." "I hope it matters," Olivia replied. "I hope it changes things for others." "It already is," Mitchell confirmed. "I've had 5 officers this month who said your story convinced them to report safety concerns instead of staying quiet. And leadership is taking those reports seriously now. That's what success looks like." "You know what the best part is?" Mitchell asked. "What's that?" "They've started calling that F-22 of yours the Hurricane Hunter. New pilots ask specifically to train in it because they want to fly the aircraft that proved everything people thought they knew was wrong." After the call ended, Olivia walked out to the flight line one more time. The desert evening was clear, with unlimited visibility and calm winds, perfect conditions for flying by sight and instruments alike. But as she stood beside the F-22 that had carried her through the most challenging period of her career, she wasn't thinking about perfect conditions. She was thinking about the hurricane, the moments when nothing was clear and everything depended on trust, preparation, and the quiet conversation between pilot and aircraft that happened beyond the reach of protocols and procedures. That conversation had saved her career, vindicated Commander Mitchell's warnings, and changed the culture of an entire command. But more than that, it had proven something that every great pilot knew but few could articulate, sometimes the most important flights happen when everyone else is grounded. The storm had passed long ago, but the lessons it taught would endure. In flight schools across the military, new pilots learned advanced techniques for extreme weather operations. In squadron-ready rooms, commanders were trained to recognize and protect officers who raised legitimate concerns. In the halls of the Pentagon, policies had been rewritten to ensure that competence mattered more than compliance. And at Edwards Air Force Base, a once-forgotten F-22 continued to fly missions that pushed the boundaries of what was possible, piloted by officers who understood that expertise came not from following rules, but from listening carefully to the truth that lived in the space between aircraft and sky. Olivia climbed into the cockpit one more time, not to fly but simply to sit in the seat, where she had learned the most important lesson of her career, that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act on principle, even when the outcome was uncertain. The small piece of tape was still there, its edges slightly worn, but its message as clear as ever. Truth flies through any storm. She had flown through the storm. Others had watched and learned. And the sky was no longer the limit, it was just the beginning. As the sun set over Edwards Air Force Base, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber, Captain Olivia Maxwell climbed down from the cockpit of the F-22 that had changed everything. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new pilots to train, and new boundaries to push. But tonight she walked across the tarmac with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had fought for the truth and won, not through politics or connections, but through preparation, skill, and the simple recognition that sometimes the most important victories happen when nobody else can see the battle being fought. The hurricane had passed, the truth had emerged, and somewhere in the vast blue sky above, the conversation between pilot and aircraft continued, waiting for the next person brave enough to listen. 5 years after Hurricane Eliza, Colonel Olivia Maxwell stood on the observation deck at Edwards Air Force Base, watching a new generation of test pilots prepare for the day's missions. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert runway, where 8 advanced aircraft sat in various stages of pre-flight check, experimental variants of established fighters, next-generation prototypes with cutting-edge stealth technology, and unmanned combat aerial vehicles being prepared for human-machine teaming exercises. Among them, slightly apart but no longer forgotten, sat the F-22 that had once been known only as Hull 237. Now it bore a new designation painted proudly on its fuselage, Hurricane Hunter. The aircraft had been fully restored and upgraded, serving as the flagship for the Advanced Weather Operations division that Olivia had built from concept to internationally recognized program. "Colonel, the delegation from NATO has arrived," her aide announced from the doorway. "They're gathered in the briefing room." "Thank you, Lieutenant. I'll be right there." The promotion to colonel had come faster than anyone expected, a recognition of both her skills as a pilot and her ability to transform a single act of courage into a systematic change in how the Air Force approached extreme weather operations and safety protocols. The program she developed had saved lives, extended aircraft service lifespans, and revolutionized how pilots were trained to handle emergency situations. In the briefing room, 20 senior officers from various NATO countries sat waiting, their uniforms displaying a rainbow of national insignia and rank indicators. These were the decision-makers responsible for implementing training standards across the alliance, and they had come to Edwards specifically to observe the program. That had become known as Maxwell's method. "Good morning," Olivia began, moving to the front of the room with the confidence that came from knowing her subject completely. "Thank you for taking time from your busy schedules to visit our facility. Today you'll observe training exercises that demonstrate our approach to extreme conditions aviation. But before we head to the field, I'd like to give you some context about how this program evolved." She touched the display screen, and footage appeared, the grainy security camera video of her landing the damaged F-22 during Hurricane Eliza. The room fell silent as they watched the aircraft emerge from a wall of rain, perfectly aligned with a runway that was barely visible through the storm. 5 years ago, this landing was considered impossible, she continued after the footage ended. Today, we train pilots to perform similar maneuvers with confidence and precision, not because we expect them to fly into hurricanes regularly, but because the skills required to execute this landing are the same skills that will save lives in any emergency situation. A British Air Commodore raised his hand. "Colonel Maxwell, with all due respect, isn't this simply about exceptional individual talent? One extraordinary pilot doesn't necessarily translate to a training methodology that works for everyone. Olivia smiled. That's exactly the question I asked myself after Hurricane Eliza. Was this a one-time feat that couldn't be replicated? Or was there something deeper that could be taught? What we discovered is that the traditional approach to emergency training had a fundamental flaw. She changed the display to show two contrasting training models. Conventional emergency training teaches pilots to follow precise procedures when systems fail. Step 1, Step 2, Step 3. It's protocol-driven and assumes that emergencies will unfold according to predictable patterns. But real emergencies rarely read the manual. The officers nodded in recognition of this universal truth. Maxwell's method takes a different approach. We teach pilots to understand the underlying physics and engineering of their aircraft so deeply that when emergencies occur, they can improvise effectively. We don't just train them what to do, we train them how to think. She switched the display again, showing a training simulator where a pilot was handling multiple cascading system failures while maintaining controlled flight. The key insight came from analyzing what actually happened during the hurricane landing. I wasn't following a checklist. There is no checklist for landing an F-22 with catastrophic hydraulic failure in Category 4 hurricane conditions. I was having a conversation with the aircraft, feeling how it wanted to respond and working with its remaining capabilities rather than fighting against its limitations. The French general in the front row leaned forward. And this is teachable? This conversation? Absolutely. We've broken it down into 4 core principles: foundational knowledge, environmental awareness, aircraft communication, and adaptive response. Together, they form the FEAR protocol, though we found pilots respond better when we call it facing emergency with adaptive response. A ripple of knowing laughter spread through the room. Military acronyms were inevitable, but no one wanted to admit their training was based on fear. Each of these principles builds on the others. Foundational knowledge means understanding your aircraft at a level far beyond what's in the flight manual, how systems interact, how failures cascade, where redundancies exist and where they don't. Environmental awareness means developing a 3-dimensional mental model of the conditions around you, even when visibility or instrumentation is compromised. Aircraft communication is learning to feel what the aircraft is telling you through subtle vibrations, control feedback, and performance changes. And adaptive response is the ability to synthesize all of this information into effective action when there is no procedure to follow. The German colonel at the end of the table looked skeptical. This sounds more like art than science, Colonel. How do you measure progress or success? An excellent question, Olivia replied. We've developed a sophisticated metric system that tracks everything from simulator performance to biometric responses during stress tests. But the most convincing measurement is this. She changed the display one final time, showing a graph of emergency landings across the Air Force over the past 5 years. The line showing aircraft losses had decreased by 64%, while the line showing successful recoveries from catastrophic system failures had increased by 83%. Pilots trained in our program are saving aircraft and lives at a rate that was considered statistically impossible 5 years ago. This isn't theoretical, it's practical, measurable, and replicable. The NATO officers exchanged impressed glances. Data spoke louder than philosophy. Now, Olivia continued, let's head to the flight line where you can observe today's training exercises. We've prepared demonstrations of 3 emergency scenarios, including a simulated dual-engine failure in an F-35 over mountainous terrain. As the delegation filed out toward the waiting vehicles, the British Air Commodore fell into step beside her. Off the record, Colonel, he said quietly, I've heard the backstory about how this program began. About the retaliation you faced for reporting safety concerns, about being labeled a flight school dropout, Is it true? Olivia considered her response carefully. The full investigation into Colonel Wagner's misconduct had been comprehensive, but much of it remained classified. What's true, she said finally, is that organizations resist change, especially when that change implies previous error. What's also true is that the Air Force, like any institution worth belonging to, eventually self-corrects when presented with undeniable evidence. The Air Commodore nodded. And flying a crippled fighter through a hurricane was your version of undeniable evidence. Sometimes the only way to change the conversation is to do something that can't be ignored or explained away. A rather extreme approach. I prefer to think of it as appropriate to the circumstances. The more entrenched the problem, the more dramatic the demonstration needed to break through. Outside, the desert air shimmered with heat as they approached the flight line. The visiting officers spread out to observe pre-flight preparations, while Olivia conferred with the day's lead instructor, Major Sofia Rodriguez, the once young lieutenant who had joined her program in its earliest days. The NATO delegation seems impressed, Rodriguez noted, especially after seeing the recovery statistics. Statistics help, but seeing is believing. Are the demonstration pilots ready? More than ready. Captain Hernandez has been practicing the mountain descent simulation for weeks. He's consistently recovering from dual-engine failure scenarios that our previous metrics would have classified as non-survivable. Olivia smiled. Just make sure he remembers this isn't about showing off. It's about demonstrating methodical application of principles under pressure. He knows. We all do. Rodriguez paused, then added, it's different. Now you know. When new pilots join the program, they don't come with the baggage we had, the mockery, the isolation. They come excited, honored to be selected. You changed the culture, not just the training. Before Olivia could respond, a commotion near the main hangar caught their attention. A vehicle had arrived, and a familiar figure was climbing out. General Samantha Westfield, now the Air Force Chief of Staff, the first woman to hold the position. Did you know she was coming? Rodriguez asked, surprised. No, Olivia replied, equally surprised. This wasn't on the schedule. They walked quickly to meet the general, who waved away the formal greeting that was forming around her. Save the protocol for the NATO guests, Colonel, she said with a smile. I'm here unofficially. It's an honor regardless, General. What brings you to Edwards? Two things, actually. First, the President has taken a personal interest in your program after the successful rescue operation last month. Olivia nodded, remembering. A diplomatic transport had suffered catastrophic electrical failure over the Pacific. The pilot, trained in Maxwell's method, had managed to land on a minimally equipped island runway during a severe tropical storm, saving 37 diplomats and staff. The White House was impressed, Westfield continued. As was I, but that's not why I'm here today. She handed Olivia a sealed folder. These are the final documents in the Wagner investigation. The last appeals have been exhausted, the last classifications reviewed. As of 08:00 this morning, the entire case file has been declassified and added to the Air Force Academy's ethics curriculum as a case study in moral courage and institutional accountability. Olivia took the folder, feeling the weight of its contents, not the physical weight, but the historical significance of what it represented. Thank you, General. This means more than I can express. Don't thank me. This was always where we were headed. Justice takes time, but it arrives eventually. Westfield glanced toward the NATO delegation examining the aircraft. Now I believe you have some very important guests to impress. Shall we join them? The demonstrations that followed exceeded even Olivia's expectations. Captain Hernandez executed a perfect recovery from simulated dual-engine failure, using terrain features and energy management techniques that left the NATO officers openly astonished. Major Rodriguez demonstrated crosswind landing techniques. in artificially generated wind conditions that would have grounded most aircraft. And Lieutenant Chambers showcased the human-machine teaming protocols that allowed a pilot to effectively control their own aircraft while simultaneously guiding two unmanned wingmen through complex maneuvers. But the highlight of the day came last when Olivia herself took the controls of Hurricane Hunter for a demonstration of the program's most advanced techniques. With the NATO delegation watching from the tower and the flight being streamed to screens around the base, she put the F-22 through a series of maneuvers specifically designed to demonstrate how a pilot could recover from catastrophic system failures. In the cockpit, with the familiar controls under her hands, she felt the same connection that had guided her through Hurricane Eliza 5 years earlier. The aircraft wasn't just responding to inputs, it was communicating, a continuous feedback loop of action and reaction that transcended the mechanical relationship between pilot and machine. When she landed and taxied back to the apron, the NATO officers were waiting, their previous skepticism replaced by professional curiosity and respect. Olivia stared at the folder, momentarily speechless. I don't know what to say. Say yes. This is the chance to institutionalize everything you've built here, to ensure it outlasts any single program or person, to create a legacy that will save lives for generations. The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and jet fuel, the peculiar perfume of Edwards Air Force Base that had become so familiar over the years. What about the program here? Olivia asked. Finally, Major Rodriguez is more than ready to take command. You've trained her well. Olivia nodded slowly. When would this start? The official announcement comes next month. Planning phase begins immediately afterward. The first cadets would arrive in approximately 18 months. And I'd have full authority over the curriculum. No political interference? Westfield smiled. That was the first condition I established when the president proposed this. Your methods work precisely because they're based on reality, not on what's politically convenient. No one wants to change that. As the last light faded from the sky, Olivia made her decision. I'll do it, but on one condition of my own. Name it. Hurricane Hunter comes with me. Not just as a museum piece, but as an active training aircraft. The cadets should understand that innovation often comes from working with what others have discarded. Done, Westfield agreed without hesitation. That aircraft has earned its place in history. Later that night, alone in her office, Olivia opened the classified folder containing the final Wagner investigation reports. The documentation was exhaustive, testimonies from dozens of pilots who had faced retaliation, maintenance records that had been falsified, safety reports that had been buried. But what caught her attention was a handwritten note slipped between the official pages. It was from Commander Mitchell, now Captain Mitchell, who had first warned her about the compromised aircraft and the culture of silence. Olivia, the note read, when I gave you those initial documents, I hoped you might find a way to expose the truth. I never imagined you would transform that truth into a movement that would change military aviation forever. The measure of leadership isn't just in the battles we choose to fight, but in what we build after the fighting is done. You've built something extraordinary, Mitchell. Attached to the note was a photograph, the original factory delivery, of Hull 237 when it was brand new and full of promise. The photograph was dated 20 years earlier, and standing proudly beside the pristine aircraft was a young Lieutenant Mitchell, her future still untarnished by the battles that would come. Olivia placed the photo carefully in her desk drawer, next to her own mementos from Hurricane Eliza, the small piece of tape with its message about truth flying through storms, the weather map she'd studied so carefully before making her decision to fly. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of her next challenge, creating an institution that would carry forward the lessons learned through struggle and vindication. But tonight, she allowed herself a moment to reflect on the journey that had brought her here. From being labeled a flight school dropout, to becoming the architect of a revolutionary training methodology, from being isolated and mocked to being entrusted with shaping the future of military aviation. The path had never been direct or easy, but it had been true. And truth, as she had learned in the heart of a hurricane, was worth fighting for, not just through acts of individual courage, but through the patient, determined work of building systems that protected and amplified that courage. As she left her office and walked toward her quarters under a desert sky brilliant with stars, Olivia thought about all the pilots who would train at the new academy, facing simulated emergencies in preparation for real ones. They would never know the full story of how their training methodology was born, the personal slights, the professional isolation, the moment of decision in a hurricane's eye. They wouldn't need to know. They would simply benefit from the hard-won wisdom embedded in every aspect of their training, that the most important skill any pilot can develop is the ability to listen to their aircraft, to their instincts, and to the quiet voice of integrity that speaks even when everyone else has been silenced by fear or convenience. 6 months later, on a windswept plateau in Colorado, ground was broken for the Joint Advanced Aviation Training Academy. The ceremony was attended by military leaders from all service branches, congressional representatives, and a special contingent of pilots, every person who had faced retaliation under Colonel Wagner's command and had since been vindicated by the investigation. As Brigadier General Olivia Maxwell turned the ceremonial first shovel of earth, Hurricane Hunter performed a precision flyover, piloted by Major Rodriguez. The aircraft that had once been relegated to the sidelines, deemed too old and unreliable for real missions, now soared overhead as a symbol of resilience and renewal. The Academy's motto, emblazoned on the architectural renderings displayed for the occasion, captured the philosophy that would guide generations of pilots to come. Truth flies through any storm. That evening, after the dignitaries had departed and the work of actual construction began, Olivia walked the perimeter of what would become the Academy's main campus. The wind was picking up, carrying the scent of an approaching weather front. Far to the west, storm clouds were gathering over the mountains, their shapes illuminated by the setting sun. Another storm approaching, but this time she was ready, not just with her own skills and determination, but with an institution designed to ensure that courage and competence would always find a home in the skies. As darkness fell and the first raindrops began to fall, Brigadier General Olivia Maxwell looked toward the gathering storm with a sense of anticipation rather than dread. Storms, after all, were where she had found her truth, her purpose, and ultimately her vindication. The rain increased, and thunder rolled across the plateau. But unlike that day 5 years ago, she wasn't alone facing the elements. Around her, construction crews continued their work, undeterred by the weather. The Academy would rise here, storm or no storm, because the most important work always continued regardless of conditions. Lightning flashed, illuminating the vast expanse where future pilots would learn the lessons that had been so dearly purchased. In that brief, brilliant moment of illumination, Olivia could almost see the completed campus, the hangars and simulators, the classrooms and flight lines, all dedicated to a simple but powerful idea, that integrity and skill, when combined with the courage to act, could overcome any obstacle. The storm intensified, but Olivia remained, facing the elements with the same calm determination that had carried her through a hurricane's fury and the turbulence of institutional resistance. This was where she belonged, not hiding from the storm, but standing firmly within it, creating a path for others to follow. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new resistances to overcome, new systems to build. But tonight, as rain soaked her uniform and lightning traced patterns across the Colorado sky, Brigadier General Olivia Maxwell stood at the threshold of her greatest achievement, not just a personal vindication, but a lasting transformation of how courage was taught, recognized, and institutionalized. The storm would pass, as all storms eventually do. But what remained would stand for generations, a testament to the power of one pilot who refused to be silenced, who found her voice in the heart of a hurricane, and who transformed personal vindication into a legacy that would save countless lives in the years to come. The lightning flashed again, closer now, and in its brilliant illumination, Olivia smiled. She had always felt most alive in the storm. Author's note: this story is dedicated to all those who have found the courage to speak truth in the face of institutional resistance. Sometimes the most important flights are the ones taken when everyone else remains grounded. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become part of our everyday inspiration community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. Did Olivia's quiet courage inspire you? Have you ever had to stand up for what's right when everyone else stayed silent? Share your own stories of unexpected triumph in the comments. Your experiences might be the next story that inspires someone else to find their voice. For more incredible true-to-life stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, make sure to ring that notification bell. Until next time, remember, sometimes the most important victories happen when nobody else can see the battle being fought. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.